Welcome to the CNBC Africa debate, coming to you live from the World Economic Forum in Rwanda, Kigali. And of course, we're bringing you this debate on Africa's pathways to transformation, how African economies are going to navigate the changing global context. In this session, we'll be focusing on delivering inclusive growth, leading the digital revolution, and driving sustainable investment. Joining me to take this discussion further is Claver Gatete, the Minister of Finance and Economic Planning of the Republic of Rwanda. Pravin Gordhan, Minister of Finance, South Africa. Makta Diop, who's Vice President, Africa, World Bank, Washington. Binta Diop, who is the founder of Femme Africa Solidarité, and also the AU Special Envoy for Women. And we're also joined by Fredrik, Jejdling, who is President and Regional Head of Ericsson, sub-Saharan Africa. Thank you all very much for joining me. Minister, firstly, I want to take this opportunity to say thank you very much for hosting us in Rwanda. It has been a fantastic experience, and I think we've all bought in to remarkable Rwanda, as the branding has been stipulating.
Thank you very much.
When doing the research for this debate, a stat stood out for me, and that is that 70% of Africa's population is below the age of 30. So I wanted to shake up the demographic. And we have got 4 global shapers in the audience to open the line of questioning to our esteemed panelists. So if you can identify yourself, I'd like to start with Tekeste Nego, who's a global shaper from Addis Ababa Hub, Ethiopia, and if you can bring your voice to bear on the discussion about to proceed.
Thank you. Hi, I am Tekeste. I'm a global shaper from the Addis Ababa Hub. 1 month leading up to this forum, we, the Global Shapers community, conducted a campaign called Internet for All, and we have identified steps that we're going to take this beyond buzz. When you get back to office on Monday, what are the concrete steps that you're going to take to help Africa achieve Internet for All? Thank you.
The question revolves around Internet for All and what are the concrete steps that will be taken on Monday morning for South Africa, Minister Gordhan.
I'm waiting for the next question. My colleague, the Minister of Telecommunications, is somewhere either in here or around here. And what I owe him when I get back within the next 72 hours of Monday is to help him to solve a procurement problem that he has in relation to the speedy implementation of broadband in South Africa. And once we cut through that, we have the beginnings of Internet for All.
And I think we must also allude to the fact that the Wi-Fi on the buses is even leading the forum in Davos, Minister. Next global shaper is Lauren Upping, Global Shaper, Cape Town Hub, South Africa, and she's the founder of Africa Health Placements.
Hi, I'm, as she said, Lauren, a Global Shaper from the Cape Town Hub. Yesterday, Mama Graça Machel said that we can't afford to go into the 4th Industrial Revolution owning half of our human capital on this continent. The World Economic Forum has also released a report now on Internet for All, and it states that women are 50% less likely to have access to internet. How can we make sure that women are connected, but they also are leaders of the digital transformation?
Binta, can I put that in your court?
Yeah, I think what Mama Graça said yesterday is that we cannot afford leaving the women behind if we wanted to have digital revolution. But there are solutions. I see what internet is doing to the women farmers in Kenya by having access to information, so to the market, so they can sell their product very quickly. So we can see what internet is doing to the women in terms of their health security. Maternal health, we see what it means. So there are so many solutions. So what we are asking to private sector, but also our government, public-private sector, is to invest on the women. Because if we say that, not just about the number that we are 50%, but it makes sense that if you invest in the human capital that are women, If I take again the sector I like very much, which is agriculture, if you empower women in the agriculture sector and you provide them with the necessary equipment, I think that we will be gaining benefit, not just the food security of Africa, but also we will be selling outside. Look at what the Rwanda women are doing in terms of coffee. So we just not produce, but we can also have the economic growth, because if we don't have the women at the table and to be the leadership of our economy, that's why the social inclusion is not happening right now. So I think that internet is going to be the multiplier effect. You know, it will be really the oil and gas of today and tomorrow. You know, so we need to use that to make sure that we empower the women of Africa. Thank you.
There's another statement that has been widely made over the course of the World Economic Forum, and that is that you should not invest in women businesses for charity, but rather because they actually do make money. On that note, I'm going to call Raquel Jacobs, Global Shaper, Lagos Hub, Nigeria, founder Beyond the Classroom Foundation. Again, over half the people in Africa are women.
Good morning. My name is Raquel Jacobs from the Lagos Hub. Thank you very much. So over the last 2 days, we've talked about a lot of things, from technology to education to agriculture. And then we have 50 global shapers here who are willing to work in the grassroots to implement what has been said here. So my question is, how can the private and the government work hand in hand with the global shapers to implement what has been said here after we leave?
Minister Gatete, followed by Fredrik.
Thank you very much for this. First of all, let me just give a comment to what has been said. I was just wondering, the way we came here from the airport to here, and the people from the WAVE team that have been assisting us. Imagine if they didn't have phones, if they didn't have internet, if they didn't have computers, and we all need to work on our reports. What would have happened? We would have no conference. We would have a conference that would have no results because we are not connected. This connectedness should not be only left for the people like us. It should be for everyone because we are benefiting from it, and other people who are not here can also benefit from it. And that's why Internet for All is a necessity. It's no longer a debate, it's a necessity. The debate should be how do we roll it out to everyone. This is the point that I wanted to make first. Then secondly, as she said, and this point was also raised by Grasa Machel yesterday, we've been discussing about agriculture, about energy, about Internet for All, transformation. And what is required is now, how do we put together the ecosystem of how we implement in view of our means, but we need to start to implement. We may not achieve all at once, but there has to be an ecosystem, there has to be a system of implementation, a system of accountability, a system of follow-up to make sure that everybody is involved. And this is not only for policymakers. This is for the government, this is for the private sector, for the shapers, for the civil society, understanding what we need to implement, and then putting a mechanism where everyone is involved. There's no shortcut. We all have to get involved, but there has to be a framework under which we perform so that we can be able to achieve results.
Oscar Mena is a global shaper from the Nairobi Hub in Kenya. He's the CEO of Business Mind Africa. Oscar.
Good morning. My name is Oscar Mena from Nairobi Hub. Agribusiness runs in my blood. But interesting is that Africa has the highest number or highest amount of unutilized agricultural resources in the world, but yet you're still a net importer of food. And in the line of the theme of these years, which is digital transformation of African resources, what can we do? One, to be able to deal with the number one issue in Africa, which is food. Second, to make the continent a net exporter of food. And third, to create new jobs and businesses for youth and women in agribusiness in Africa. Thank you.
Makta.
Thank you very much. I think you spelled out exactly the Africa region strategy for this coming year. We have an opportunity. We have the turn down of the world economy where commodity prices have been going down. And with high commodity prices, what will happen in the countries in Africa is that we don't exploit anything else except our oil and gas and mineral. And we left those sectors like agriculture not growing fast. now that we have slowed down in the world economy and we don't have a growth driven by commodity prices, we have a wonderful opportunity to really invest in agriculture. And when it starts happening, what are we trying to do in this context? Try to increase the size of irrigated land in Africa. The African continent, I think, only have between 4 and 7% of irrigated land, which is far below any other continent in the world. Secondly, we try to reduce the risk for the farmers by bringing insurance to the farmers so that when there is an external shock, they can benefit from it. Third, to increase access to technology. What happened in agriculture in Africa is that the slow increase that we have was only through factor accumulation, more land, more product, but the productivity has been flat over the last 2 decades. We need to have the green revolution in Africa, and that's what exactly we're trying to do in our program this year. So this is a wonderful opportunity to increase the production of food, which will be helping having a smooth urbanization, because we're able to feed people who are moving to the cities and increase income of people in the rural areas. And that technology for it is a central part of it, because, as Binta said, it allows farmers to be connected to markets.
Fredrik, my huge apologies. I wanted you to comment on the public-private partnership elements, so please do come in. I must say kudos to your public relations department. As I was walking up the stage, I got the announcement about the interoperability switch, which has just been announced in Rwanda, and maybe you want to start there, given the timing of the announcement.
Sure. No, thanks for that. And I think, first of all, the collaboration between the various players is fundamental for driving internet for all. I think we as a technology provider, of course, has a role to play in terms of developing technology that is affordable, that can penetrate further out into geographies to connect more people. Likewise, the government and regulatory has a big responsibility setting an environment that is conducive for growth, that is inclusive.
So, Fredrik, we're having a slight problem here. Your mic, unfortunately, is down. The beauty of live television, we're going to fix it, and I'm going to come back to you. So they're going to come up with a handheld mic. Unfortunately, usually we would go to an advertisement break right now, but you're going to see the bare bones of a television studio. Minister Gordon, you wanted to add, Minister Gatete?
I just wanted to add on the point on agriculture that the Vice President of the World Bank has just mentioned. Clearly, this time we should take seriously the issue of productivity. That's why we have been feeling short of, because initially we have left agriculture for the government, for the farmers, and anybody who can support farmers but using the traditional means. To modernize that, productivity becomes the essence, and that's why we look at all the inputs that can increase the productivity part. And also the agriculture infrastructure, such as irrigation and other things that really go into this one to make sure that agriculture becomes a business. And secondly, we also need to look at the value chain, not look at the farmers only, at the primary production, but the whole chain up to the industry level to make sure that the entire chain works smoothly, including the contract farming, but also looking at the sustainable financing for the entire chain, right from the farmers, but also up to the industries. And once you add value, that's when we get more value for everyone along the chain. And I thought that I wanted to just emphasize that point.
Right, we're now going to do this as, I can't hide it from you. The mic is going to get passed to Fredrik. Thank you very much. There we go. Would you like to continue with your comments?
I guess I go from the beginning then, right? No, what I was saying is that on the line of the public and the private partnerships is fundamental. First of all, we have a role as a technology provider to provide technology that's affordable even further out to the next 2 billion that needs to be connected. From a government perspective, regulatory perspective, we need to get a mobile broadband plans and spectrum policies that are harmonized across the continent to produce lower cost of production. So those are fundamental pieces. I think what we've done here with government Rwanda to get back now to the interconnection switch here, that is a way then of actually lowering a fundamental barrier of entry for a lot of people in terms of transaction costs in the financial environment. By then connecting various mobile money platforms between different operators into the Visa world, into the Western Union world, we remove a lot of intermediate transaction fees. And that is a basic or a major hurdle for a lot of people to get into the world of transaction.
Fredrik, can I break that down a little? Because, again, just perhaps for lay people out there, essentially what this new system means is that if you are with Tigo and you want to transfer money to MTN, you no longer need to withdraw the cash and then deposit it to MTN. You can make a seamless transaction.
Sure. No, that's it. And if we extend that into different type of financial services like insurances or whatever it might be, it opens up a completely different world. And I think when it comes to farming and these things, you need to create an environment where entrepreneurs actually can do a business. And the first step into that is by providing financial inclusion. And through the system and the mobile money systems and the mobile phones, we believe that's a very good step into the economy to start with.
Minister Gatete, you want to come back in?
Yeah, I just wanted to come in. This is something really very simple. We've been having interoperability for the ATMs and also for the POS, whereby you can just go to another bank, ATMs, and be able to withdraw money. But if I wanted to use my phone, we have so many of them. The Tigo, Cash, you have, for so many of the telecoms. You cannot use your phone to be able to transfer money from one bank to pay someone who has a different bank from yours or who has a different technology from yours. What we are trying to do is to make sure that also when you're using your phone, you can be able to do all the transactions using the phone. The most important thing that this one brings also is that you don't have to withdraw money. That means that all the money stays in the banking system depending on who you are transferring to, but you are transferring from one bank to another bank to someone's account. But the money stays in the banking system. That means you have an increased amount of money that can be lent out to the population.
I think it's important that we spend a little time on this subject because this is leading the digital revolution. And Minister Gordon, I'm going to come in here. The World Economic Forum Competitiveness Report 2015-2016 had South Africa ranked at 49, leaping 7 places. And the reason that we leapt 7 places is because of technological readiness. That's after 4 years of decline. So this talks to what digital investment in ICT can do for an economy.
Yeah, I think you're reinforcing the point, but I think we must be careful, as my colleague said, that even the digital economy requires an ecosystem within which to actually operate. In other words, people must have access, the prices must be reasonable, rural areas must be able to get their access as well. There must be the right balance between private and public sector in terms of the kind of investment and costs and charges that are actually made. And I think what we are realizing in the last, say, 2 years or so is the multiplicity of purposes, as you've just heard, that the digital platform can actually avail, from job seeking to employers finding the right connection. I met somebody last night from South Africa who's doing crowdfunding on a small scale and has already supported the development of a coffee shop after raising 75,000 rands through crowdfunding. And what do you get in return? If you contribute 500 rands, you can have 5 cups of coffee at that coffee shop. 1,000 rands, you can come and have 10 cups of coffee at the coffee shop. But they have generated quite a few businesses in this particular regard. And the key challenge, I think, for our kind of countries is the urban-rural divide and how we can get smallholder farmers, those who have the potential to start commercializing, to start accessing markets. And that's where different types of infrastructure need to be, if you like, coordinated and planned so that there is this marketplace where your product can in fact be sold. For example, there are very successful examples on the continent and in South Africa. For example, cut flowers being supplied to the world, and where the logistics are arranged in a way in which we work as a region to enable that to actually happen.
I just wanted to come back on the ecosystem that Minister Gatete said that we need to create the environment for the accessibility. And I go back to the issues of women in agriculture. The government of Africa have committed to provide land to women and the young people to become entrepreneurs, and probably attracting the investors like private sector to invest on all the entrants that we need, and including internet and so on and so forth. But it's not happening. I mean, how many women have access to land right now? In many countries in South, 70% of women are the farmers or working in the in the rural areas.
Here's another stat. I'm not interrupting you. You're going to continue. But Visa Kenya is saying more than 125 million women in Africa have no access to formal financial services. This is endorsing the argument that you are putting forward.
You started by that, by just looking into the land sector. We are absent, left behind. But if you go to the bank, because we are talking about lending and access to finance, you don't have a title. It belongs to somebody else. So how can you access the finance, the market, if you don't have even a title in your community? So we need really to look into solutions and who get the solution. Government have to make sure that they do what they have to do. And private sector should come in, because government lead the process and do what because they are the one who can open the door at the first stage. So that ecosystem need to be put in place. And I wanted that next year we say that we have solution. This is a good one, where government have provided 30% of arable land and irrigable land to women or to young people that are here. That it happened here, it happened in Kenya, it happened in my country, Senegal, yes, or South Africa. So we say it has happened actually. Second, private sector, like you will say, this is what we put to make sure that it has also happened. And we start counting, we start looking into the indicators, we start monitoring, we start saying it's solution-oriented. We have talked enough. I think now it is really we need to invest, each one of us, including the women farmers that
so
are
you've galvanized,
available.
Binta, you've galvanized most of the men on the panel, because I've got nods from Minister Gatete, from Makta, and from Fredrik.
Yes.
So less about, sorry, I missed yours, Minister Gordon, I apologize. So we've got nods across the board. Everyone wants to come in here. It's less about the talk, more about the action. So gentlemen, beware. We need action right now. Minister Gatete.
Yeah, I think the point she's raising is very, very important. You cannot talk about access to financial services if you don't have land. Luckily, in our country here, all the land is registered. And it also, we have in place also the law that allows women to also have the same rights as men on accessing land. From the time the law was put in place, as of last year's data, we saw that 52% of the land in Rwanda is owned jointly, husband and wife. And then 26% of the land is owned by women only, and 18% is owned by men only. So we could see the benefits, because once you have land, then you can access the financial services because you have collateral, which is needed. At the same time, you could also, of course, use it when you have the community exchange, where the warehousing receipts can also be used against your land to make sure that as you produce, you can use your produce, but also the land as a backup, meaning that actually have options, equal access and equal options like men. Without sorting out the issue of land, it becomes very difficult.
Makta.
Yes, I just want maybe to add another dimension, which is, let's take the analogy of what happened with education. At some point, we want all to increase access to education, but we pay less attention to quality. And as we are expanding the access to internet, we make sure that the quality will be there. And in some cases, we see with the access a declining level of service quality. So it means what? It means we need to have regulators which are stronger. And in the context of Africa, we might want to think more and more about regional regulator. Regulator will cover all of a region, and it can have standards which are common across countries, but also has more power in enforcing regulation. I think that's what the East African community is moving towards, and I've been able to remove fees between countries. The second one is the content of internet. Let's make sure that as we are expanding the access to internet, the content coming from Africa increases. We don't want to continue being net important of content of internet. Let me give you an example. We have the cinema industry in Nigeria. We have the music industry in West Africa. Let's make sure that the content that our service and cultural industries produce is exported, and the copyrights are there to help the producers to get the resources. Last point is South-South cooperation. We have here people who have been developing application, very interesting application, but I'm not sure that outside the own country, people know on the other side of Africa what they are doing. What about doing having an extra effort to make sure that when an application is developed in Kenya by a Kenyan developer is known in South Africa or he knows in Senegal. And that we can use this application because today, from what I've seen, there are applications that are developed on the internet which are extremely good quality by people in Africa and don't have access. Last point. Last point is to be able to risk-taking. This is a business which also have a lot of casualty, because it's innovation. And when you are in the US, you have Chapter 11, and you can rebound and do. We don't have something similar in Africa. So you have a group of people who are young, innovative, but we don't have the safety net which allows them to rebound if they face some challenges. That's another thing that we need to think about if you want to have really the IT revolution that we would like to have in Africa.
Fredrik.
Now, just bringing the point along, if you now create an environment conducive to growth, if you create this ecosystem that we put in place, we have a pretty positive view of what it can impact a continent like Africa. For example, if we look at the mobile broadband subscriptions today, there are about 150 million of them. We expect to go to about 800 million by 2021. And if you combine that mobility broadband with the cheap storage solutions like the cloud, you provide an innovation platform and a platform for inclusion that has never happened before. And what that does actually brings the power shift from institutions like, for example, mine, potentially for governments, because the information or advantage might not be there. So you create 800 million potential entrepreneurs that could develop an Uber of Africa, that could develop something else in farming or whatever it might be. I think to be a little bit more practical about it, I understand for this to happen, there are also some very local African considerations, like the ticket to land ownership and these kind of things that might need to be added to this sort of global thing that we see. And with different tonalities, really this global thing we're seeing will apply equally as much for Africa, but probably a higher speed.
Mr. Gordon, do you want to come in here?
Yeah, on the land question, I think in many parts of Africa, including South Africa, you have communally owned land where you cannot get title deeds. Therefore, you cannot use it as collateral to raise loans. And so part of the transformation that we are talking about in Africa is the question of traditional leadership, the kind of controls and rights that they have versus democratic rights of women and men in those particular environments. The second point is around financial innovation and different types of products. I think the bigger banking institutions and financial institutions need to invest a lot more in terms of providing new types of cheaper products at the lower end of the market, so that financial inclusion really does mean something and is not a marginal corporate social responsibility activity that they actually engage in. And perhaps WEF should start measuring the extent to which these financial institutions are contributing to the bottom 40% that the World Bank talks about, and their access to finance and financial facilities and so on. And perhaps the third point, to reinforce what Makta was saying, is that we need to move beyond national ecosystems to regional and continental ecosystems as well. And the quicker we do that, using the cloud or any other mechanism, the faster we're going to be able to potentially leapfrog. I was talking to some people last night at your soiree who come from Europe and says, I doubt whether Africa is really engaging in a leapfrogging exercise. I am sure most of us think that leapfrogging is possible. Rwanda is a good example, and in other cases, other countries are equally good examples as well. So we should set our ambitions a little bit higher and also get to a point where we can sell technology developed in Africa to Ericsson, not only buy Ericsson's products in Africa.
Let's move to driving sustainable investment, which really builds on the conversation that we're having. And post WEF Africa, which was held in Cape Town, we spoke then, Minister Gatete, about the Central Corridor. This is Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, and South Sudan. I picked up some very tangible results that goods leave the ports now in 7 days, not 1 month, and that telecommunication costs when it comes to roaming have been reduced or capped at 10 US cents per minute, which is much down from the 20 to 22 US cents previously. Now, that has been felt on the ground. Traffic has increased 4 to 5 times in some territories as a result of that capping of the roaming fee, and in some instances, even 9 times. So let's talk about this model, the Central Corridor, and the results that it's yielding, given that leadership of the respective countries involved meets every 2 months. Minister Gatete.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that's a very good point you are raising. And since we are talking about economic transformation, our leaders in the region realize that actually you cannot sustain your economic growth without embracing the regional integration. And it started by we are all in the East African community of 5 countries, Burundi, Rwanda, Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania. And we realized that we needed to move faster. And we started in the Northern Corridor by the leaders of Uganda, Rwanda, and Kenya, and realizing that actually we needed to do something and to do it very quickly, because as we get more economic shocks, we can rely on the region to become the buffer for us to sustain the growth. And so the point that you are making is, how do we make sure that the people are linked? And that's the first thing that they solved by saying, why don't you allow the people to move freely without needing a passport? Now you can travel from here to Uganda to Kenya without needing a passport.
So mobility is key.
Mobility is very key. The second is to make sure that people can work in either countries with no restrictions. And at the same time, as you mentioned, rightly mentioned, we need to be one area network for internet, for roaming, and that makes it easier and everybody gains. At the same time, we need to make sure that whoever enters Rwanda can go to other countries as well in terms of tourism. That also we all gain. At the same time, we need to link the payment system so that you can move money around. Now we have the East African payment system linked so that we can be able to pay around. Actually, we're working now on linking the stock exchanges around the region so that you can trade across the border much easier. But at the same time, it was also required that we make sure we remove the non-tariff barriers. As you mentioned, moving the goods from one country to another was very, very difficult. It used to take 21 days. In Rwanda now, from Mombasa to here, and now it is taking 5 days. Why? Because the heads of state took decisions. They moved the roadblocks, they moved the way bridges, enforced the speed at the customs, removed the triple, I would say, payment of the insurance, and making sure that the goods can be tracked by the cargo tracking system. And working together and having one clearance area for, at Mombasa, working for all of us, that really cleared everything. And by the way, with no donor money, with no other money invested, it was just a
We're going to talk about the financing solutions in just one moment, because this is obviously a big discussion point. We need to look at innovative financing models for long-term sustainable investment, given the global growth scenario, and of course, China's manufactured slowdown. But I still want to stay. North-South corridor, we're forging ahead with this. Are there lessons to learn? Where are we on the project, Minister Gordon, as we see it?
There was a session this morning where the project is that there's been a handover from one of the institutions, or a collection of institutions, to NEPAD. They've identified a number of sub-projects. A level of planning has actually happened in respect of those projects. And I suppose we are at the point, the pre-implementation point, both in terms of financing and implementation. On the financing question, we're preempting you a little bit, we're going to have challenges, because we still, as somebody put it this morning, the capital markets, the big capital markets, are not quite used to Africa. Still work with particular kinds of perceptions of the African continent, have a particular conception of risk and reward. And the reward that's required to invest in South Africa, in many instances, not necessarily all, is at quite a high level. So we've got to work out how we meet those thresholds. But the lesson from East Africa is get on with the implementation. So find a sizable project that there is money for, demonstrate that we can do it with the current financing capabilities that we have on the African continent, and that will inspire others to begin to come into it. And in many of these instances, governments have to lead.
And one of the buzzwords at the World Economic Forum here on Africa in Kigali is certainly coming to bankability of projects, bringing projects from the initial stages to bankability. Talk to me about the role that multilateral banks need to play in helping to perhaps, and I'm going to take it a little bit further, de-risk Africa.
Yes, I think that Minister Gordon raised a very important point, which is the market perception of risk in Africa. which is not linked to the fundamentals. When you look at the fundamentals of any economies in Africa and you compare them to the fundamentals of other countries as a part of the world, and you look at the risk premiums that the market is putting, you see that Africa, there is a strong bias, negative bias in Africa. So we need to remove that perception of risk and do everything in that. So it's about property rights, it's about a judiciary system, it's about conflict, it's about a certain number of things that leaders are working on. The second thing is to start finding instruments to de-risk it. And the investment needs in Africa are so important that it's not donor money, it's not public investment, we should be making it. We need to mobilize long-term financing. And where is long-term financing? It's pension fund, it's insurance. So what we would like to work together, and we're putting our mind together to think about instruments of de-risking or convincing a pension fund manager in the US or in Japan to put 1% or 0.5% of the deposit in a productive investment in Africa. And what we need to do is exactly what Minister Gordon said. Let's take a project which works, which we can implement them well, and demonstrate to the rest of the world that there is capability in Africa to handle complex projects and to do it well. And I think as we're doing that, we'll be convincing more and more people who are sitting on long-term resources that we need to be able to invest in Africa.
The key, obviously, to attract pension fund money and insurance money is to maintain investment grade status. Absolutely. So we've got to work together to do that. Bintu, you want to come in?
I think I agree with what Mahtar and Minister have said in terms of opening the market, but also making sure that we invest more from the bank, ADB, but also the World Bank and others. But I have one question to Mahtar, because I know that you are more or less providing all the necessary financial support to our governments, and governments are here, the World Bank, the ADB, all of them. And we see the necessity to invest, not just in the big infrastructure. We need those infrastructure, the road, the airport, and so on. But what about investing on the people themselves? When I look at the bank, they will tell me, no, we just fund the government. Now, we don't see how we can go to the women themselves and lend them the money. But they can do it in a different way. We need just to think out of the box. I know that the bank, the World Bank, is improving the system. But we wanted to know by today, how do you going to unlock that and make sure that it trickles down to the people?
So we have a scenario here where we've got Diop versus Diop.
Yes.
Magda.
So job 2 is answering to job 1. So what he says is that we are doing something. As you know, in the Great Lake region, we are funding a large project to support gender-based violence, and which was directly given to non-governmental entities to implement with the support of the government. We are using more and more the non-governmental organization to implement our projects, particularly in fragile states where we think that the capability and capacity is not easy. In terms of gender financing, all our projects now have a particular gender aspect on our project, where we try to make sure that that group is targeted and given the adequate resources to be able to give the development challenges. Third, we are also working with the government, because our institution needs to have a sovereign guarantee when we are lending. So to a country, because the Minister for Finance will be responsible for repaying their debt, so they have to provide that guarantee. What we are seeing more and more is that governments are very open to get the money and find a way to retrocede that money to non-government organizations to implement those projects. And we are seeing...
Magda, I'm going to need to jump in on the Diop conversation. Go to Fredrik. I want to come into de-risking Africa. And I had Hans Vestberg, the global boss of Ericsson, in Davos on the CNBC Africa debate. Very, very optimistic about the Africa story and that you are here for the long term. But there must be a point when red flags do occur and it's difficult to convince your global board to pursue an investment strategy. What is the number one risk for you?
No, but I think, first of all, to the longevity point, not a lot of people might know we've been here 120 years. And that speaks a little bit for the longevity we have in the market. And I think from our perspective, at least what I try to tell my board, is that you need to have a longer term perspective on Africa, because without doubt there are some hurdles now when it comes to currency devaluations in the markets, etc. What we do to de-risk that, and that's probably the short-term biggest thing for me now, is running this region for Ericsson. And what we do there is we use actually Sweden Inc. a lot, and we use government-funded, secured financing for a lot of build-outs that we do across Africa. And that's an intermediary step to de-risk the shorter term. Medium, long term, I don't think you can, you have to ask my board, but I don't think you will find anyone who is not in for the opportunity in Africa over medium, long term.
Minister Gordon, you want to come in?
Yeah, just to reinforce 2 points. One is long-term financing versus what currently is largely short-term financing. And so unless we resolve that mismatch, which is probably linked to my second point, but we've got to resolve that in one way or another. And somebody sitting in this audience or sitting at Davos at some point in time needs to have faith in Africa, get a better sense for what is going on, and help us to set up more demonstration projects which will get that wheel turning. The second is, language plays an important part in communicating who we are and creating the perceptions of what we are. Are we really wanting to de-risk South Africa? Or are we saying, come and understand Africa better? Because there's risk all over the world. If the United States elections go in a particular direction, how much more risk is there?
But the visible
Europe
stats
at the moment is, gravitating around 1.5% growth. There are other parts where there are serious geopolitical problems. So comparatively, we might actually have vast parts of the African continent that are not understood well enough, but are potentially there for very nice returns for business people to come and work with us on.
So a number of the external measurements, the reports out there, are working against us. And I refer now specifically to the IMF's recent report on sub-Saharan Africa. And I know that you can't paint Africa with one brush, but the reality is that GDP growth for 2015 came in at 3.5%. For 2016, it's forecast at 3%. That is half the average of 6% over the last decade, and it is marginally above population growth. That 3.5% for 2015 is the lowest level in 15 years. I know that you cannot paint Africa with one brush. I'm going to say it again. And there are winners and there are losers right now, and a lot of it is driven by that global oil price and what is happening to the commodity shocks. But I want to come back to something else that potentially can insulate us, and that is Minister Gatete. We chatted in Washington recently at the spring meeting on deepening domestic funding, deepening our local capital markets, and funding African projects with local capital. Your thoughts, sir?
Yeah, thank you very much. What is very clear, and that's what actually they were discussing when they were talking about financing. Traditionally, our development has been mainly financed by governments. Government from taxes and governments from borrowing from international financial institutions like the World Bank, like ADB and others, and Exim banks. But we realize that to sustain the growth, you need the private sector. And the private sector requires resources. In a country where you don't have a capital market, they rely on deposits in the commercial banks. And that deposit is short-term, and it's not enough. And they cannot go to the international market to borrow because their ratings are low, or they don't have a system of rating the banking system. That becomes a problem. And that's why we need a capital market, which actually also attracts private money globally. All the public, the private, a vehicle that is known all over the world is a capital market. And that's why, in our case, we are also working to develop a capital market to make sure that we have a modern capital market here in Rwanda. But we are saying it's not enough. Since we're in a region, we're also saying, why can't we interlink our capital markets in the region? The one for Uganda, the one for Kenya, and for Tanzania, which we are discussing, and also having a platform that can be interlinked to all the capital markets, and they are treated as one block, as almost one capital market, and making sure that this can provide incentive, first of all, for the region, the insurance companies that you mentioned, the pension funds that you mentioned, those ones can invest anywhere in the region. And this becomes an incentive for outside private sector to have an assurance that if we invested in our currencies, if we invested in our facilities here in the region, that becomes useful. That has two advantages. Number one, there is more resources. Number two, they are also spending and there is no borrowing in hard currency, meaning that actually they buy our facilities in our local currency, but bring the hard currency within the country. That helps in terms of the external balance. It also helps our currencies in the region.
Minister Gordon, certainly the East African community may be leading with the charge on the Central Corridor, but when it comes to domestic markets, domestic funding markets, South Africa is the winner across the African continent. And perhaps what Minister Gatete is suggesting, and I'm going to just take the cue here, is that Africa could take the charge on integrating capital markets across Africa, given our strength in that arena.
There was a stage when pension funds across parts of Africa were talking about consolidating their money. I'm not sure what has happened in the last year, but then creating the capacity to do exactly what Minister Gatete is saying, but on a broader scale. The second is that, for example, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange is working with many stock exchanges across the continent to do exactly that, create stock exchanges that begin to attract capital. But one of the challenges that used to be the problem, I'm not sure if it still is, I've been away for a short while, every country wants their own stock exchange. Now, you can't have 54 stock exchanges on the African continent.
We're going to have to give up a little of that sovereignty.
So something needs to give in that area so that we can go forward. The third is that various institutions, including ones from South Africa, have been working across the continent, developing skills in treasuries across the continent to manage debt. And that's an important skill to have if we actually going to go into the capital markets and not get ourselves into trouble. And the last point, and it's a lesson from the current crisis that we have across the continent, arising from both the oil price drop and the commodity price drop, is when you borrow too much in foreign currency, you get yourself into trouble. And so the South African practice has been maximum 10% borrowing in foreign currency. And that's a lesson that I think that the continent can also emulate. But that means then that internal resource mobilization becomes quite critical. Yeah. African elites and others who profit from Africa need to pay their taxes. And that's what resource mobilization is about. Because if you do, then you increase the fiscal base. And the initiative by the President of Nigeria to say return illicit flows that are lying around in other parts of the world, let's put it politely, and stolen money must in fact be returned. And that money should be invested in the infrastructure that we're talking about. And that will give us an edge as well. But the last thing is that making speeches about these things won't get us there. We need to organize ourselves as an African constituency together with our partners from around the world and work towards these objectives, and I think those can be done.
So I think we all realize less talk, more action. We are seeing tangible progress. World Economic Forum on Africa to World Economic Forum on Africa. We've got 5 minutes left. I'm going to leave it to each of our panelists to conclude, starting with Fredrik. It's been 3 days of robust debate. We're looking at Africa rising, Africa falling. I think everybody here leans to the optimistic side of that equation. Africa is still rising. Certainly there are winners and losers, as I said earlier. But Fredrik, your takeaway from the World Economic Forum on Africa here in Kigali, Rwanda, over the last 3 days, followed by Binta, followed by Makta, Minister Gordon, and Minister Gatete. Over to you, sir.
No, I think what is very positive is that the medium long-term perspective on Africa's market for us and the discussions I've had here is absolutely still there, in spite of small little hurdles around some currency depreciation and something like that, but it's not taking away the long-term attractiveness. So this is a market that is not from our company.
Binta?
Africa is rising, but also we need to be a bit cautious to say the people of Africa are not rising yet. So we need to make sure that when we meet next time, we invest more on the people of Africa. We didn't talk about it, but we need also to solve our problems, some of those problems at our conflict. And I think the Northern Corridor is one of the project integration that really make sure that the people, mobility of the people integration, it can prevent, it can help to solve of our problem. The last thing that, and I can quote our friend Achaleke from the McKinsey would say, internet could account for about 10% of Africa GDP in the 10 years to come. So we need really to tap on the digital revolution, the gender revolution, because you see what Rwanda is doing. So we need to tap on those gender revolution, digital revolution, but also the agriculture revolution for Africa to continue to rise with its people. Thank you.
You make the comment that we've seen what Rwanda is doing, and really you can't miss the billboards that also say, that also say that Rwanda is the best place for a woman to be in Africa. So that certainly is hitting home.
Yes. And in particular, I was here in 1996, and so what Rwanda, the impact on genocide. I visited some of the places where the corpse was still there, women lying with the baby that have been killed. So I have seen Rwanda and that after genocide, and have seen Rwanda now. I think we need to applaud Rwanda's efforts and the people of Rwanda and the leadership of Rwanda.
I'll be very short. Implementation. So that's a good lesson of Rwanda. Let's do it.
Yes.
Second thing, let's trust the youth. This is our main asset.
Minister Gordon.
He stole my line. So I was going to add the youth revolution to the other three, because if we've got the large number of youth and some of the enterprising people are here, if they begin to think differently, if they create a paradigm economically, socially, and politically as well, which means that we want greater inclusivity, we want the quality of life of ordinary people to actually improve, not just the elites at the top and the middle classes, then the African future, as a result of Africa rising, is going to be a very different proposition. And that's the potential that Africa has through implementation, but in a different way. And that is to demonstrate to the world that we can create, out of the kind of transformation that we are talking about, a more equal society than anywhere else in the world.
Minister Gatete.
Thank you very much. Really, they have said everything. I just wanted to add that here, the growth that we are talking about should be inclusive in the real sense. And what I mean here is that the growth has filtered down to benefiting the ordinary people in health, in education, in other areas. Number two, we need to focus really on looking at the new sources of growth, making sure that we pay particular attention to the youth and to the women. I remember the president challenged us in government after genocide when he mentioned, especially that's the beginning of the gender, where he said 52% of our population is women. Now, the men are less, they are poor. How are they going to develop the entire economy? And from that point, things changed completely, and that's why we are getting the results that we are getting now. Thirdly, we cannot continue to grow without involving the private sector. We have to find a new model of working with the private sector in terms of growing our economies. And then we need, as Makta mentioned, implementation. And finally, all this cannot be done without leadership. I wanted to say leadership matters, and this is a new topic that we also need to discuss at some point. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for joining us for this debate, coming to you from the World Economic Forum on Africa, which is currently in session in Kigali, Rwanda. We've been discussing Africa's pathways to transformation. In summary, inclusive growth, implementation. Less talk, more action. Pay particular attention to Africa's women and Africa's children, and don't forget that the underpin to this all is leadership. Thank you very much for joining us.